At long last, coming in just under 8 months since the Switch 2 released, and just under 11 since the game itself dropped, we got our first Switch 2 Xenoblade game. Xenoblade Chronicles X: Definitive Edition Space Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. I think Nintendo needs to work on their titles. It's becoming beyond parody at this point. I said something like this as a joke before, not thinking they'd ever actually do it. Anyway though, this continues the trend of everything Xenoblade since 2023 being pure shadow drops, as the upgrade patch costing $5 released at the same time as the announcement. However, there will also be a physical release on a Switch 2 cartridge, releasing April 16th? The same day as Tomodachi Life for some reason? That seems like a recipe for XDE getting buried a second time when its initial launch was already overshadowed by the impending Switch 2, but that's not really what we're here to talk about because, well, it's already out. We can talk about how this works. This upgrade patch boasts resolution of up to 4K and frame rates of up to 60 FPS, albeit with no HDR support or any new features or content whatsoever. You will be paying a price for purely performance upgrades and nothing else. And yes, the Switch 2 physical edition is also $65. Though at this point, it's pretty easy, at least in the US, to find physical Switch 1 editions for much cheaper than $60, so if you just want to get the upgrade digitally, it's really easy to do so and pay less than you would have for the game on release. And yeah, if you want a physical copy for your shelf, you probably should just go with that because, yup, that sure is a Nintendo Switch 2 edition box art. This is what the Switch 1 version looks like in comparison. Now let's talk about the game part. Do keep in mind, I am not Digital Foundry. I don't have tools or knowledge to properly assess every single thing going on here. I would definitely trust other people with opinions on the objective technical side of things, though I'm going to give my subjective evaluation of all of this. I also do not have a 4K capture card, so what you're going to be seeing is Switch 1 footage that is 1080p 30 FPS, though recorded as a 60 FPS video file, and then 1080p 60 FPS Switch 2 footage. I will be putting the Switch 2 logo in the upper left-hand corner for any Switch 2 footage from now on, but do keep in mind that the resolution is not going to noticeably change, so I'm going to be doing a lot of using the built-in zoom function just to actually examine details in detail that you wouldn't be able to see on a 1080p recording. Also, do keep in mind that you're watching this through YouTube compression, and in this specific case, I think it makes some of the issues with the Switch 2 edition a bit harder to see, because everything is fuzzier and less detailed on a YouTube video compared to the actual thing, so you might not 100% be able to see everything I'm talking about, but in those cases, my words are more accurate to what I was actually seeing on my screen playing it in 4K than what you might be able to see in a YouTube video. I have some drawbacks, some complaints and concerns, but we're going to talk about the positive first because I want to talk about the positive first, and there is a lot of good in here no matter what I'm going to say later. The first thing is, when you see the little up to qualifier when it comes to the frame rate, that's not reason to be concerned. Yeah, it technically isn't a purely locked 60 FPS, and I guess it's kind of concerning that a Switch 2 upgrade for a Switch 1 remaster of a Wii U game can't hit locked 60, but it doesn't seem to drop lower than like 57 point something, and not for longer than a couple seconds at a time, which is basically going to be imperceptible to most people, so it's not too big of a concern. And playing Xenoblade at above 30 frames per second for the first time is a great experience and just makes everything feel a whole lot smoother. You have to keep in mind, Xenoblade games have always been very ambitious on a technical level, and that means they've never really had consistent frame rates. The past few years have seen the biggest improvements in that department in series history, and it seems to only have been accelerating in the past 1 year. Xenoblade 1DE was the first game in the series to really hit a mostly consistent 30 FPS. Then Xenoblade 3 did the same thing while being a ground-up new game and not a remaster, and then Xenoblade XDE on Switch 1 was a more consistent 30 than the Wii U version of X, while also being the first 1080p Xenoblade game. Then, if you plug any of the 4 Switch 1 games into your Switch 2, they are a fully consistent 30 the entire time, and now we have an almost consistent 60 with XDE. So while it seems like we're riding a pretty exponential curve up, I don't think we're going to go past 60, even if the Switch 2 is theoretically capable of that. I don't really see a need for a Xenoblade game specifically to go any higher than 60 FPS, and given how the next game is probably going to be very technically ambitious again on new hardware, I wouldn't be surprised if it shoots for 60 but settles around in mid to upper 40s most of the time or something like that. The other major improvement is input lag. X has always had some of it, with the Switch 1 version actually being worse than the Wii U, but the Switch 2 edition has the least input lag the game has ever seen, allowing your art switching and QTE presses to be even snappier and more responsive than ever before, with the improved frame rate not changing anything about how the game plays. QTEs aren't any harder to hit or anything like that, it does play exactly the same, it just looks almost twice as smooth. Anything that looks like a misinput in either the Switch 1 or Switch 2 footage is purely a result of me getting confused because every single Xenoblade game has a different control scheme. Load times are better, though honestly by not too noticeable an amount, and that's not a critique of the Switch 2 edition, that's just more praise for the base Switch 1 edition, because its load times are already pretty fast for the size of game this is, and absolutely mind-blowing when compared to the Wii U version, that an additional improvement of like 1 second per fast travel across the entire world doesn't even register to someone who's been playing this game since 2015. This all sounds great so far, and you would be correct in thinking so, but unfortunately, we have yet to talk about the other thing that was improved, the resolution, because here's where things start getting a whole lot hairier. Both myself and the rest of the internet haven't been able to completely figure out exactly what's going on here, but it seems to be some combination of upscaling and anti-aliasing gone wrong. From what I can tell, there's actually a massive asterisk on saying the Switch 2 edition runs in 4K. It seems to be natively running at the max Switch 1 resolutions, 720 handheld 1080 docked, then being upscaled to 1080 handheld 4K docked, with a bunch more anti-aliasing than the Switch 1 version had slathered on top of it to try and hide the fact that you're now looking at mostly unchanged Wii U textures in glorious 4K, which, let's be real, is all I ever really wanted out of a Switch 2 edition. You would think this would be a bigger problem docked because it's a much bigger resolution jump, but the biggest problems are in fact in handheld, where there's artifacting everywhere, especially in motion. Characters' faces look incredibly blurry even when pretty close up to the screen, albeit not nearly as bad in cutscenes, and the entire game basically looks like it had an oil painting filter layered over it, or each individual frame was poorly AI upscaled before being transmitted to the screen. Anything remotely detailed or far away is basically going to be shimmering at all times, shifting between various smeared approximations of what it's supposed to look like. And God forbid you try to read any text that isn't part of the UI, or look at detailed body parts of creatures or ornate areas of skulls and the like, because nothing will be comprehensible to you. This is made worse by the fact that the draw distance and LOD thresholds have not been changed from the Switch 1 version, which means you're going to see the extra smeared, even lower detail stuff from a lot further away than you probably should at this resolution before it all of a sudden pops into a more detailed but not much less smeared version that persists until you smash your face right up into it. It is pretty egregious to the point where, even though the 60 FPS does work perfectly fine in handheld mode, XDE Switch 2 Edition is giving the sub-standard def sub-30 FPS handheld Xenoblade 2 from 2017 a run for its money. If you primarily play your Switch 2 in handheld, I would straight up say avoid this upgrade unless it gets a substantial patch improving things, because it is, quite frankly, a downgrade from how the Switch 1 edition was. If you have a physical Switch 1 copy, I do believe you can eject the virtual game card for the upgrade pack, and it will just allow you to continue to play the Switch 1 version, so if you're swapping between handheld and dock, you can do that if you'd like, but you are completely SOL if you have it digital. But how does it look docked? Well, it's certainly nowhere near as bad as it is in handheld, but it still leaves a lot to be desired for all the same reasons. When docked, it is a bit noticeable to see that a few things like lighting, some shadows, and some reflections have been marginally improved to a noticeable degree, but all the problems from handheld are still there. Any intricate texture will be shimmering, things in the distance will look straight out of an AI-generated image from 3 years ago, and this is especially noticeable if you look directly into a cloud. It's so anti-alias that there's basically a light film grain effect over the entire game. And this effectively means it's so anti-alias that everything is so smudged, thin objects loop back around to looking like they're aliasing. In most cases, things don't look too bad unless you lean in close to the screen or use the Switch's zoom-in feature. But I was sitting leaning back, so maybe 4 feet away from a 28-inch monitor, and I was noticing a lot of screwed up things. Especially the ground in Primordia and Noctilum while flying in a Skell. And that's not just limited to being in the air, it starts looking bad as soon as you hop in your Skell. Once you're that high up off the ground, It just turns into oily sludge with an effective resolution of the best the Nintendo 64 could bring to the table in what's supposed to be the 4K upgraded version of the game. Just as an example, I gave my character the tattoo that sorta reminded me of the Chrono Trigger logo. Now, if you look at that, on the Switch 1 in 1080p, yeah, it's pixelated, but it's consistent. If you look at it on the Switch 2, it just keeps shifting every time you move the camera or zoom it slightly, and never actually settles on what it is supposed to look like. Yeah, in cutscenes, usually he's either so far in the background that you can't notice it very well, or the main focus so he's close enough to the camera where it at least approximates what it's supposed to look like, but that is a facial feature of the Create a character that can't be displayed properly in the Switch 2 edition, and that's a pretty big problem. Any ornate piece of armor or texture in the environment that's supposed to have text on it, or any graphic that's supposed to look like something, has this same effect. Stuff like the missions on the image board and arms manufacturer or division logos on outfits just don't look correct anymore. I haven't looked at any cutscenes that show stuff like that in detail, like the one in Chapter 3 where Lynn looks at her comm device, but from what I could see, it is better in cutscenes than gameplay, but the shimmering is still there, and if you look closely, you can still see myriad issues. Oh, and on top of that, people reported screen tearing with the opening pre-rendered cutscene in handheld, so that doesn't work either. On top of that, while UI fonts do display in higher resolution, and icons are completely untouched by any of these issues, perhaps also even being in a higher resolution than in the original, UI animations did not get the frame rate increase. Most of them are still 30 FPS. This is especially noticeable if you get overdrive charged up and compare the frame rate of the gear icon in the middle of your arts palette with everything that's going on in the actual battle. This causes a bit of weird artifacting when scrolling the map, and that's whatever. But also now if you zoom in on the map, you can see that there are areas where tiles of map images were not put together correctly, and there are very visible seam lines that you can in fact see if you just lean into the screen, even though I'm providing zoomed in images here. Now, disclaimer, this might have been in the Switch 1 version, the resolution just wasn't high enough to see that, but you should fix stuff like this if you notice that in your up-resed version. Also, in Noctilum, sometimes the overhanging shadows straight up break and make the ground look like this. I'm not sure what that was caused by, but that is a thing too. It really feels like no playtesting or fine-tuning was done for this upgrade, and that basically as soon as they got the game running stably at the right frame rate, they shipped it. And it's pretty concerning that not only was the game released in this state, but that the upgrade is paid, when it's much, much worse of a job than almost every single free upgrade patch. I don't really think the term Switch 2 Edition should even be used for an upgrade that doesn't include new content, unless it is a straight-up cross-gen game releasing on both systems on the same day like Legend ZA or Prime 4. It almost seems like they're trying to retroactively turn Xenoblade XDE into that kind of cross-gen game, but it's too late to do that when the best time to get more sales by doing it was make the Switch 2 Edition a Switch 2 launch game, and also too little given the actual quality of the product provided. And the worst thing is, I don't think anyone was asking for this kind of upgrade. I think most people just kind of wanted native 1440p 60 FPS for all 4 games, and it's pretty frustrating to see Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom get exactly that with new higher resolution textures and HDR support day and day with the console, while Xenoblade XDE, a game that most people agree should have released with the console, gets this 11 months later. XDE really should have been pushed as being by the makers of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and had the Breath of the Wild position in the Switch 2's launch lineup. That is, having a previous gen version that works perfectly fine, and then a next gen version that acts as a big on-launch tech showcase. Now yeah, okay, Mario Kart World is also a Monolith Soft involved open world game, but this now leaves XDE with the position of the game that people were confused why it didn't have a Switch 2 edition to begin with, and then started asking for one. And it only got one 8 months later, by the time people had already started forgetting about it, and it ended up this botched. I can only hope that this was either a very rushed outsourced project, or an extremely rushed Monolith Soft project, and now I'm just hoping that this isn't going to be the formula used for Switch 2 editions of every other Xenoblade game. And that because there's a physical edition coming out in 2 months, the day 1 patch for that will fix all these, or there will be a patch to actually fix this stuff later down the line, but even then, this should have either been a day 1 Switch 2 patch for free that increased the resolution properly, or a Switch 2 launch title that had a cheaper Switch 1 version, and the Switch 2 edition being built from the ground up to run properly on the Switch 2. On one hand, I am glad that this is making people who were waiting for this to play Xenoblade X actually play Xenoblade X, and the game has jumped back up on eShop charts, so that's pretty neat. But I wish the thing people were paying for all of a sudden wasn't a pretty big double-edged sword that might just end up encouraging this shoddy of an upscale instead of a proper Switch 2 edition for all the other Xenoblade games. More people playing Xenoblade X, that is good. Xenoblade XDE possibly hitting 1 million sales. That's also good, albeit it might only happen because of people double dipping on physical Switch 2 editions, but I can't say I'm a big fan of the execution, and I don't think it's really worth the money at the present moment in time. Frame rate's great and all, and I might just be weird, but I have to say, I prefer my video games looking a bit more pixelated but consistent and correct, instead of higher resolution but filmed on an out-of-focus camera with a lens smeared with Vaseline. Of course, all of this criticism is assuming you're playing it either in handheld or on a 4K screen. If you're playing the Switch 2 edition on a 1080p screen and set the Switch 2 to output in 1080p, you are still going to get the aliasing, but at least it's running technically in its native resolution, so it's probably not going to look as bad. And I doubt the issues would be that bad even up to 1440, so I could pretty easily recommend it for the frame rate alone in those cases. The good thing is, all of these issues are at least patchable, and I sincerely hope that they are addressed at some point in the future, especially prior to any other Xenoblade Switch 2 edition or Switch 2 upgrade patch being released, if similar techniques will be used. That's all I got for the Switch 2 edition as it stands today, but I'd like to do a little bit of conspiratorial thinking to try and find out exactly how this ended up this way in the first place. The big thing to remember is that Xenoblade 3 had its release date pushed up, which meant that the game must have been effectively done the same time it was announced, or they wouldn't have been able to actually finish the game and have it in a complete state with the sped up schedule. We also know that Nintendo seems to have finished games from various studios and drip feed them out, sit on them, release them whenever it makes the most sense to them. 3's DLC Pass release was also heavily accelerated from when they said it would be. As in, it was faster even when accounting for the move up in release date. Which means Future Redeemed was probably also done earlier than it seemed. And pushing this up also means that XDE might have been sat on for a while, and it was being used as a fill hole in release schedule game, with the March 2025 date being whenever they chose to put it out. So maybe XDE got pushed back to fill a hole, and it was originally supposed to release further away from the Switch 2, and that way it's not having a Switch 2 edition wouldn't have been nearly as conspicuous, or it was originally a Switch 2 launch title with a Switch 2 enhanced version based on the incomplete 60 FPS mode found in the files, and that got scrapped when it ended up being pushed out of the Switch 2 range, or even a relic of a Switch Pro enhanced edition before that morphed into the Switch 2 if old rumors are to believed. That is usually used to theorize that Monolith has a new game coming this year instead of next year like their release schedule would make you expect, but it could also explain the state of Xenoblade Switch 2 editions. Now, let me be clear, XDE was always going to be the Xenoblade game to get a Switch 2 patch first. If they do hit all the games, it's probably just going to go in backward release order, with Xenoblade 2, the game that definitely would take the most work to get a functioning Switch 2 patch, being last just because of the amount of work it would take. And I could see this Switch 2 edition being rushed out just because of all the people begging for them as soon as they saw XDE wouldn't have one, and that none of the Xenoblades had them in the first round of Switch 2 editions that came out with the system. If this is true, and Monolith made the Switch 2 edition themselves, then that meant that they would have to go back to XDE after having completely wrapped on the project for a while, and gotten started probably on at least 2 other Monolith-developed games. Would they have to go back to old projects to also update the other games? Yeah, but if Wind Waker coming to NSO is any indication, there aren't any more Zelda games to give Switch 2 upgrades for right now, so you could just give the Xenoblade games to the people who did the Zelda ones. I know it's a different engine, but the Zelda ones are pretty good. At least turn down the anti-aliasing knob and use actual DLSS on the next patch for XDE, I don't know. No matter what though, this doesn't tell us anything about when other Xenoblade Switch 2 editions will come, or when Monolith's next game will come, because we don't know who made this Switch 2 edition. All I can reasonably glean from this is what I've already said. It's just extra unfortunate that this botched launch happened to Xenoblade X of all games in the series, the one that's already the least popular, that's already been used as a punching bag by fans of the rest of the games for years, the one that got held back by being a late Wii U title the first time, and having a pretty unfortunate launch window the first time with DE, and also the one the least people are familiar with. So, not as many people will be playing the Switch 2 edition, seeing the problems because they know how the game is supposed to look. Like, the little thing that pops out from every collectible in the distance to let you know that something's there does not look the same any 2 times you will see it in any of my Switch 2 edition footage because of how the fake text stuff keeps getting distorted in different ways, and someone playing the game for the first time with this edition would just think it's supposed to look like that instead of being exactly the same every time, because they wouldn't know any better. If this happened to Xenoblade 2, the outcry would be big enough where I would be much more confident that this would get fixed in a much more timely manner, but now I'm concerned that come April 16th, it's going to be the exact same thing we're playing today, except it's on a cartridge this time, so you definitely can't downgrade to the Switch 1 version. And no one's gonna buy it who didn't pre-order it already because of bad word of mouth, and because Tomodachi Life is coming out the exact same day, setting up X to potentially underperform for a 3rd time. It's unfortunate that this is probably the biggest misstep the entire Xenoblade series has had, but this isn't going to affect the quality of the next game. It's not necessarily going to affect the quality of any future Switch 2 editions, and all of this stuff is fixable, so as long as all the other editions that don't have new content are free, and that along with fixing the resolution and aliasing issues in XDE, they also add some new content to actually justify the price hike, like maybe Event Theater, New Game Plus, new cosmetics, better scale or character customization, new lore entries in the database, maybe covering some stuff from the Japan-only art book, maybe audio drama versions of the Japan-only short stories that were published in the lead-up to the original Xenoblade X but weren't reissued at all in any language for DE, even though they're completely canon. Stuff like that. Then no harm, no foul in the long run, but this is still a pretty bittersweet pill to swallow in the now. That's all I have to say about the now, though. So until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.